In the back.
Yes. Excuse me. Kelly Lammers with State of Nebraska, and in full disclosure, I am a state regulator. I won't call myself more lenient, but nonetheless, I have a question of all three. Relative to paper number one, in looking at the mathematics, and for decades, I have looked at state exams versus federal and looked at both trends and levels. How do you consider joint examinations as a entity goes into increased regulatory scrutiny? To move quickly then to paper number two, as the bank failures lead to lower lending, is this a situation in which the community that was experiencing the bad lending emphasis was over penetrated and it was moving to a more normalized effect, or is this simply a pendulum swing? And then finally, with paper number three, actually quite enjoyable in terms of, is this relationship banking? And all of a sudden I'm stepping back and looking at the resolution papers that I have worked with are all cost basis. And is there a desire, or could there be, with more mathematics? I understand you can't do a bank exam with mathematics, but in this case, with more mathematics, is there actually a value in having a like-minded lender acquire that type of business of the closed institution? And with that, I just wanted to say thank you. Incredibly thought-provoking papers.
Should we collect more questions? Okay, yeah. Should I answer?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, first of all, there's no, when I say lenient and strict supervisor, there's no judgment involved. It's an empirical statement. It's an empirical statement. If you consider the exact same bank and you take a state regulator, the CAMELS rating will just be lower. And so I think it's an excellent question on the joint examinations. I didn't really talk about this, and we actually don't really mention it in the paper. But for the main result of the paper in the causal sense is what we're looking at is this idea is, okay, if you get a federal guy early on, you're more likely to get on the problem bank list, and then you're just going to have all kinds of things happen, all kinds of motions get sent into action, and people are going to start looking for more problems, and that's just going to sort of lead to this overall more scrutiny. Now that effect is actually a little bit attenuated if you consider joint examinations, where you have a state-led exam and it's actually accompanied by directly by federal examiners. So I think it's an important detail if you really want to sort of get the exact differences between those two, right, the levels. But in terms of the qualitative difference, it's not gonna matter. But it's an excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Also, excellent question for my paper. So this we don't really dig into too much in the data. It's not really a dimension that we're emphasizing in the current analysis. But without looking at the data, I would say, in theory, when the cost of funding goes up, you would expect the bank to be more selective with the projects that they're funding, and perhaps this, in theory, would say, the average quality of loans that they make would be of higher quality. But that's something that empirics could speak to more concretely, and something perhaps that we do in the next stage of the project.
Yeah, so it's a great instinct for analysis, because it's actually the thing we're currently working on is looking at the acquirer's side of these bank failures to see if there's any characteristics of the acquirer that can help explain this gradient I showed at the very end in terms of which bank failures are more harmful to small business than others. With the story, so the hypothesis would be that if you have a community bank that fails and is then taken over by another community bank that has a similar philosophy in how it extends credit to small businesses, then maybe the effects aren't as big, because again, that acquiring bank will again lean on the relationship model of extending credit, whereas if, I'm going to pick on JP, like if JP Morgan were to swoop in and buy up a community bank, it might say, well, actually, we don't do the whole going down to Friday Night Football to figure out who's the good business proprietor. We have this algorithm written by these kids at MIT or whatever that tell us exactly who the good credit risk is, and then all of a sudden all of this soft information goes away. And then I think Jim, we talked about this in the past. So one thing that I've come to realize is when we think about loan officers in particular, I think the standard economist's view of a loan officer is like, oh, well, that's a screening device. Like a person comes in and then, yes, there's some small talk, but really the loan officer's screening, like, was this a bad risk, good risk, what is this kind of person like? But what I've come to realize is that actually there's a lot that goes into, and of course I think the practitioners here are going to say, yeah, we know that, you don't have to tell us, but for me, I don't do small business lending, so it's kind of new for me, is that there's a lot of post-loan kind of support that a loan officer will also provide. Because if I go out and I'm like, well, I want to start a food truck business, and I go get my loan from, let's say, Jim's Bank, but that loan officer not only extends and screens me, but also it has a lot of local knowledge. And will then also be able to tell me, like, hey, by the way, and buying that huge truck is probably not right. I've seen this a couple times before. You make these big capital outlays, that's not right. You want to start small. So there's also this sort of local info, and I want to call it not mentorship directly, but some additional support that goes on after. And I think probably the larger banks maybe aren't as good as that than the others. So we're definitely now bringing in information about the acquirers and trying to then see whether the sort of difference in asset size or type of bank charter could explain that gradient. So thanks for that great question.
And that is the community bank value prop, and you get right down to it for small business in a lot of ways. I mean, our customers, when they come to us, it is not just about, can I get the check so I can go do whatever I want to do. We're having those conversations, not, you have them after the loan, but you really have them on the front end a lot of times. A lot of small business customers, they may know how to work, have a great auto body shop, but they don't understand cash flow, okay? And it's a complicated subject for a lot of small business owners. They don't understand the fact that they can grow themselves into bankruptcy from a cash flow standpoint if they don't understand how to have sustainable growth levels and things, so just small things like that I think really do matter, and it's where community banks, I think, earn that margin that we have to have a little better margin a lot of times than a JP Morgan does.
Real quick here, just kind of to touch on that a little bit with the relationship. So one of the things, an acquiring bank is not buying the relationship. You cannot buy a relationship, they're buying numbers. And that kind of goes along with what you were saying, that if they don't have that relationship, they may not, help them as much, but they also don't understand the credit, and they're buying potentially tainted assets in their perspective, and so they're not going to have the same latitude given sometimes as well. So there's some of those other things that could be at play there. There's going to be a perception amongst the loan officer that, I don't really want to give them that extra latitude, and they don't know them. You have to build that relationship over time, and so if that doesn't take place. So another thing to consider with that.
In the back.
There we go. Jeff Trammell, Merchants Marine Bank, Pascagoula, Mississippi, Chief Operating Officer. Used to be a bank examiner, state examiner. Stefan, you and I have to talk after this. I was a hard examiner, but that's okay. On the last paper, the hidden harms, I can see it working with small businesses before, where when you take them off track, they tend to be highly efficient, be very myopic, very focused, and when you change the way they do business, it upsets the apple cart. And I can see maybe there is something there to the failures, just not being because they made bad loans, just because now their attention has changed. The way they're getting funds, the way they do treasury management's changed. I can see that. It's very interesting work. On the second paper, higher rates, I don't know if there's a correlation between sort of like market gains. When a market gets in a downturn and people tend to sell, the late sellers are usually the small retail lenders or retail equity buyers. They tend to buy low, buy high and sell low. It's almost like there's a information cost, the cost of delayed information, where now that there are bank failures in my local area, I don't trust banks as much. Therefore, I'm requiring a higher return on my money. So it might be different, just like the equity markets kind of work. People sell too late, a little scared. They're the same way with their money there. But very interesting paper. And the last one, it recalls when I was a bank examiner, I used to talk about how the report of examination in any sense was never shared with the public. And the chart that you had up there where all the closures were on Fridays pretty much after the Great Depression. And and you said, that's a supervisory led deal. And I always wondered, and in these talks I had with examiners when I was examiner, is that the customer no longer has information on what's happening with their bank anymore. They kind of advocated that to the federal regulators, and so they don't know when their bank is bad or not, right? They don't get Campbell's reports. They don't get anything that indicates the reports are bad, and maybe that causing that delayed reaction in banks being closed at a point where they get to that tipping point and they finally tip over, and having more public information may let the people vote with the dollars faster. Don't know if there's something there or not, but I appreciate it very much.
Yep.
Yep. Good afternoon. Greg Bertone, Regional Director, FDIC Chicago. And I want to thank you guys. It was great papers for give us some additional thoughts on some things. And just one observation that I wanted to share, and I'm interested in if you had any comments on. I've been through a few crises in my time, and one of the things that I heard anecdotally consistently was from those institutions that either survived or entered the markets afterwards is a few years down the road, they said some of the best loans I made were the loans that I made at that time. And it may have been because they got to pick the best of the worst, or there wasn't any competition, or that they could, price set where they were at. And I'm just curious how to quantify that, if it can be quantified, and especially Jim Edwards having to gone through something like that, his thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the flip side of that we talk about in our credit committee pretty regularly is, bad loans get made in good times. And we've been in pretty good times now. And so, we tell that to our younger lenders who didn't see this, Great Recession, didn't live through that, because there is a little bit of that, if you've never bitten by the snake, you're not worried about it. It's just something that's supposedly out there in the bush. And when you've seen what can happen, that's a problem, then you're more cautious about it. So I think that's absolutely true, and you're right. I mean, the other thing is, when times are really challenging like they were in 8, 9, 10, small business customers are much less likely to forget that you stood with them, that you continued to fund their accounts receivable, that you said yes when they had a great opportunity. I mean, they remember that, because credit's, when credit's not easy to get, it's more valued, just like everything else in supply and demand that our economists can talk more eloquently about than I can.
Stefan, you wanted to?
Yeah, I wanted to add something about the comment or question on sort of the supervisor's role of providing information to the public. I think so. Bank failures may come as a surprise to certain retail depositors who are not paying attention on any given day, really, basically. But I would argue that banking supervision is really sort of key in kind of making financial statements of banks accurate. And banking supervisors, in my view, don't do it because they want to inform the public, and the public really maybe doesn't care about downloading call reports and making some charts, although the public could. And so some people do it for them. But really, the banking supervisors do it in order to sort of be able to take legal action. So to say this in a different way, when supervisors are criticized, why did they not take action at SVB? SVB had a Campbell's rating of 2. If you walk into SVB as a supervisor and you say, oh, we think, 2 weeks before SVB actually fails, you walk in and say, oh, we should close you guys because we think you're not doing good. They're going to take you to court and they're going to win, right? Because they had equity over assets 15%. So if a supervisor wants to close a bank, it's a long process in which the financial statement needs to reflect the adverse conditions of the bank, and only then legal action is actually warranted. That process, which again, it's not necessarily the supervisor's goal to create some information for the public, but it does actually make it very much transparent which banks are in bad conditions, and which ones are not. And to Chris's point, he showed one graph of an earlier paper of mine. Bank failures are, from these public information, are extremely predictable. It's hard to miss them. And in part, the predictability comes from the supervisory process, which is slow, which requires sort of this long, back and forth between a bank and supervisor in trying to agree of what, the asset values are, which then governs the capitalization and then the scope for legal actions. But so just all that saying, even if Campbell's ratings are not public, all that information is in the call report, and that's because of supervisory action. It's because supervisors audit. In both state and federal in an equally effective way.
Well, it seems like we have a lot to talk about in the networking break, which is about to begin. So please, let's thank Christopher, Stefan, Brian, Yannick, and Jim